On this episode, trees in bioretention, again, and what happens when the system gets old and you need to dig it out and start again. What will the community think? Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. And specifically, welcome back to this mini-series where we're looking at trees in bioretention systems in quite a lot of detail. Now back in episode 93, we looked at trees in bioretention systems in a little bit of detail, but now we're doing it in more detail. This is the third episode in this mini-series, and it's another one where we are responding to a viewer question. So on episode 93, Peter asked, could you talk about resetting a bioretention system that has trees in it? Yes, Peter, yes we can. So, behind us we have the Hoyland Street bioretention system. We talked about that in the first episode of this mini-series. And so I think the implication of Peter's question here is, what happens when this system gets old and you need to dig out the filter media? And what happens to the trees? And I think quite specifically, what are the residents going to think? Because when I've talked to people about this before, a big question that often comes from council maintenance staff is, people get really attached to their trees and frankly aren't happy when we go and cut them down. How are you going to deal with that perception when we need to reset the system? It's a really, really valid question, but I'm going to come into it through a slightly roundabout way. And the first thing that I want to address is, why are we resetting the system? There's this perception in the industry that bioretention systems have a really distinct, short life, and that every X number of years, we need to come in and dig them up and start again. And I want to address really briefly, actually it's probably not going to be brief to tell you the truth. I want to address, in an appropriate amount of time, which may be brief but may be really long, I want to address where that perception has come from, and when we look at that in detail, what that actually means. So the reason, as I understand it, that we have this perception that bioretention systems have a limited life and that we need to replace them, or replace the filter media, comes from some research, in Australia anyway, comes from some research that was conducted by Monash University and the Facility for Advancing Water Biofiltration. And they were cognizant of the fact that bioretention systems remove phosphorus by a couple of different methods. If that phosphorus comes in particulate form, so it comes in and it's already attached to a particle in the stormwater, because it can come in two forms, particulate and dissolved. If it comes in as particulate, it will come into the system, it's flowing through the filter media, the particle gets physically filtered out by the filter media, and the phosphorus gets trapped there with it because it's attached to the particle. Fairly straightforward. And that keeps going as long as the system is still draining, that can still happen. On the other hand, you have dissolved phosphorus that is not attached to a particle, it's just floating around, dissolved in the water. The way a bioretention system removes dissolved phosphorus is that particle comes down through the filter media, it's filtering through, and it gets attached to it runs into and becomes attached to one of the particles in the filter media itself, typically one of the fine particles in the filter media itself. And so, at least theoretically, there are a finite number of spots on these fine particles where the phosphorus can absorb to. It's like seats in a stadium. Say you're going to the rugby or something, right? There are a finite number of seats in that stadium, so you can get people coming in, they'll find a seat, people coming in, they'll find a seat. Eventually, you can have lots more people coming in and there's no seats for them, right? It's essentially what's going on with the phosphorus. There's lots of fine particles in there, there's lots of dissolved phosphorus coming in. The first ones can find spots to be, to stick to. It's either adsorption or absorption. I always get them confused, so I'm not going to try and pick which one it is. But essentially, the dissolved phosphorus can get stuck to those particles in the filter media, and eventually you can run out of particles, run out of sites on those particles for the phosphorus to be stuck to. So with that in mind, Ford went and did some research where they built lab-scale bioretention systems. And this is a really, really busy road for essentially a suburban road. Ford built lab-scale bioretention systems, got secondary treated effluent that has lots of phosphorus in it, and dosed those bioretention systems really regularly and really consistently with that secondary treated effluent, and then measured what came out. And of course, the first dosing, there wasn't very much phosphorus coming out. So the treatment's happening. And they kept dosing until they started to get this pulse of phosphorus coming through, which is the breakthrough point. That's the point where there's no longer any more sites for the dissolved phosphorus to stick to in the media, and it's all just flowing straight through and out the other end. Then what they did, because they knew the concentrations of the phosphorus that had been coming in, and they knew how much water they'd put in, they made an estimate of how much phosphorus they'd stuck through the system in that period of time. And then they went to the literature and looked up how much phosphorus is typically in stormwater. And you can do a calculation and go, okay, that was approximately X years worth of stormwater. And that's where this age of bioretention system things in Australia, when people talk about it, that's where that perception comes from. Because that research showed, and I'm not 100% sure on what the exact number is, because people throw around different numbers here, but it showed that something like the phosphorus breakthrough point was going to occur around 7 to 10 years old on the system. Maybe 15, you know, people throw different numbers out there. But the point is, it was a relatively young number. And so then the implication was, oh, well, at that point, the bioretention system's not doing the treatment it's meant to, and we need to reset it. There's a few things that challenge that idea though, right? Firstly, let's consider the fact that bioretention systems do more than just remove phosphorus. The potential beneficial things that bioretention systems do are treating sediment, treating phosphorus, treating nitrogen, treating litter, treating heavy metals, treating hydrocarbons, doing hydrologically beneficial things, urban microclimate, like urban cooling / microclimate stuff, and generally looking good. That was a list of 9. We need to look at what happens to those things each over time. Because this perception of age of bioretention is built primarily off only one of those functions, the phosphorus, well, shouldn't we be considering the system as a whole? So sediment. Bioretention systems will continue to remove sediment so long as the media is freely draining. They might accumulate sediment on the surface such that at some point you maybe want to get that surface sediment off there, but that doesn't involve necessarily completely digging up the system. Nitrogen is complex in how it's removed, but primarily is facilitated by the plants and, more importantly, the biota that lives in and around the roots of the plant symbiotically. There is no theoretical limit to a bioretention system's ability to remove nitrogen so long as it is A, draining, and B, has plants in it, preferably plants of certain species that are known to do better with that nitrogen removal. Heavy metals. Okay, the heavy metal pathway is relatively similar to the phosphorus removal pathway, so maybe some question marks there about its capacity, or bioretention's capacity to remove heavy metals being exceeded at some point. Hydrocarbons, I have less data about that, so I'm not going to go there. Hydrology benefits, they will all still be achieved so long as the bioretention system is still draining. The point being here is that I look into the future of bioretention and see this situation where for a certain period of time, when the system's young, it is going to operate exactly as we intended it. And at some point, so from year 0 to year exactly what is, I'll explain in a minute, but to year it's going to behave as we intended it. And after that point, some of its potential benefits are going to drop off. Phosphorus will drop off, potentially. Heavy metals might drop off. But things like nitrogen, things like maybe sediment removal, hydrology benefits, will all continue on into the future so long as we have a system that drains and has plants in it. And the plants help to keep the system draining. There's another complicating factor though. I mentioned that while the number isn't exactly clear to me, this, bioretention needs to be set every 7, 10, 15, what exactly the number is, years. The thing is that we're starting to get bioretention systems that are quite old, like the Hoyland Street system, that are 15 years old, and others in other states. And what no one's actually seen, to the best of my knowledge, in any of these older systems is actually that phosphorus breakthrough occurring yet. Some of these older systems have exceeded the age, because this thing's 15 years old and some of those estimates were like 7 years, 10 years for phosphorus breakthrough. They've actually exceeded the age of what the lab testing said the phosphorus breakthrough should occur at. So we don't actually have any real world proof that the phosphorus breakthrough really happens. Theoretically it should happen, but it's not. So why not? One hypothesis, and it is only a hypothesis, I haven't seen any research to try and prove whether this is true or not, but one hypothesis is that once these systems start behaving as ecosystems and cycling, for example, leaf drop in the Hoyland Street system onto the surface, replenishing organic matter, getting the biota working through, that somehow they might actually be able to restore their phosphorus absorption capacity, or at least to continue to grow it slowly over time, such that, okay, these accelerated lab tests that Monash did, and I'm not bagging the lab tests, they're really useful, right? They gave us really useful info. But the accelerated lab tests were over a short period of time and didn't provide for any of this potential remaking, re-establishment of the phosphorus absorption capacity. So theoretically, even for phosphorus, maybe for heavy metals, that breakthrough point isn't where we think that breakthrough point is anyway. We just don't know. Okay, back to resetting the system. Turns out it was not a brief description of that. It was a long-winded story, but it's all relevant. So back to resetting the system. My take on it is, I have really big question marks as to why you would ever's a really big statement. Like the entirety of human history from this point forward is a really long time. So ever suggests that we're never going to do it. But I have really big questions about, in the immediate future, why we would actually be considering resetting a bioretention system if two things were happening. If the system was still draining and it had functional plants in it. I don't understand why you would reset a system, because if those two things are still happening, worst case scenario, we're still removing sediment, nitrogen, we're still getting the amenity benefits, and we're still getting the hydrology benefits out of it, and maybe we have diminished phosphorus and heavy metals. So you have a system that is still largely functional, but not quite as good as it was. Well, resetting the system's really expensive. I just don't see how that's going to stack up. So I have question marks about why you would even reset the system in the first place. I think, yeah, that is exactly it. I actually think that we would only be resetting systems if they had otherwise failed. So the question is, I think the important question here is more so, how do we maintain these systems and keep them functioning such that we avoid the potential causes by which we might need to reset it, which primarily, in my mind, the big long-term risk is, how do we make sure the systems don't block up over time? And my response to that is, one, protect them from house building sites and serious sediment loads, but then two, make sure we have desirable vegetation in there, because certain plant species, particularly melaleucas, have been shown in lab testing to be particularly good at maintaining the hydraulic conductivity of the systems. And so I actually think in certain respects that putting trees in bioretention systems reduces our long-term chance of needing to reset them and avoids that problem altogether. I do, however, agree that if you ever did need to reset a system and it was near to houses and people had become attached to it, become used to it being there, and a council went through and cut down all those trees, I think there is a really high risk that there's going to be kickback, and I think we should be cognizant of it. I don't think it's a good enough reason not to do it though. Okay, that was an exploration of resetting bioretention systems with trees in them. I hope you found that useful. Peter, thank you for your question. I appreciate it. As we said in the last video, we really appreciate these viewer questions because they prompt us to explore these interesting, really interesting topics in detail. So if you have a question on any of our videos, by all means, leave them in the comments on YouTube, leave them in the comments on Facebook, go to the Ideanthro website, contact us through there, whatever you want to do. If it's a question that we can answer in a video, we will do that, because then we can share what we think about that question with everyone. And we think that is great. Thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned for more in this series on trees and bioretention systems. Yes, I can talk more about this. Stay tuned for that. We'll see you next time. But before you go, you thought you were getting away. I realized I need to tell you something really briefly. A bunch of the ideas that I've talked about in this video with respect to when the pollutant performance runs off, when does it diminish, when does it not, my initial thinking, when I first learned about this and first started thinking about this, came from discussion with Alan Hoban, who currently works at Blytanner Consulting Engineers. And I just feel that I should recognize that because it was initially some of Alan's thoughts that got me on this track, and then I'm trying to now relate it to trees and bioretention and the like. So thank you, Alan, as always, for your very interesting discussions that we have. If you'd like to know more about Alan, we filmed a video with him way back in something like episode 32. You can go check him out there. Thanks guys, see ya.